Is this the guy we're backing?
I think that's the one, remember? Excuse me, this is a private meeting. Would you mind? Yeah, I think that's the guy we backed last year, isn't it?
Why is the church so concerned about persons on the other edge of the world? Because they're still getting edged out.
Okay, I'd like to welcome our viewers tonight again to MCAT, to our program Naturally Speaking, which is on the air the last Tuesday of every month, with the next show showing on the June 24th, so we hope you join us again then. Tonight we're going to be speaking about the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act, which is an ecosystem-based wilderness bill which many of our viewers have probably heard about, but I'm sure there are many of you out there who perhaps have heard about the bill but don't know a great deal about it. And we've got 4 speakers with us tonight who are going to give you different perspectives of what this bill does and why we need to protect ecosystems as opposed to pockets of wilderness. Let me introduce you to our speakers tonight. To my right is Cook Johnson. Cook is a fishing guide here in western Montana, and he'll be talking about the sort of recreation perspective. Over here is Dr. Thomas Power, who's the head of the economics department at the University of Montana, and Tom will be giving you an economic perspective. And then to my left is Dr. Mary O'Brien. Mary is a professor at the university, also an environmental studies professor, and comes from a very wide background in the environment and can give us a perspective, a sort of a biological perspective. And then we have Dan Funch from the Alliance for the Wild Rockies. The Alliance for the Wild Rockies is the environmental organization that have introduced the bill or written the bill, so Dan will be able to give you the finer details of the bill. Dan, let's start with you. Perhaps you could explain to our viewers what's involved with the bill and perhaps talk a little bit about why it's different from the type of wilderness bill that was introduced last year by Senator Max Baucus.
Sure, I'd like to. And I'd like to use the map to help illustrate some of the main points. But first, let me begin by saying that NERPA, the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act, is primarily different from the past legislative efforts we've seen to resolve the wilderness issue in a couple of important respects. First of all, it looks at an entire region rather than a state. And this is a departure from the past. We have seen a lot of wilderness bills that have dealt with states, and it's been our group's feeling that we need to address the needs of ecosystems and, in fact, our entire Northern Rockies bioregion rather than a particular state. So that's the first way that it's different. The second way that it differs from other wilderness attempts is that it tries to incorporate different designations in addition to wilderness to try and achieve ecological and true ecosystem protection. And I'd like to maybe take a look at the map and describe some of those. We've got a map here of the Northern Rockies, And again, I want to just orient us on this map. We see the Montana-Idaho state line really prominent here. And here's the state line with Wyoming. Over to the west, we have the Oregon and Washington borders here. Now, the Northern Rockies is a region of course, we all know great beauty and outstanding natural values. It's been the feeling and the development of a lot of the history of conservation biology that's kind of brought us to the point where we realize the need to protect entire ecological systems. And we've identified about 5 major ecosystems in the Northern Rockies. The first is the well-known, centered around Yellowstone National Park. And it's the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. You can see here that the actual ecosystem is much larger than the park itself. And that's important. In the past, a lot of our protected areas have failed to take a look at the entire ecological systems. And instead they've represented and protected only small parts of them. The second major ecosystem is to the north, the Northern Continental Divide, or some folks call it the Glacier Bob Marshall ecosystem. This ecosystem is, of course, renowned for its beauty as well, has some incredible wild rivers, teeming with wildlife, millions of visitors each year. To the west, we have an ecosystem that, like the Greater Glacier, will straddle the international boundary here with Canada. We call it the Greater Selkirk Cabinet Yaak ecosystem, and it includes the southern Columbia Mountains here in British Columbia. It includes the Selkirk Crest, the Yaak Valley of western Montana, and a couple major river systems. Moving south, we have the Greater Salmon Selway ecosystem, and the core of this ecosystem is the large protected area, the River of No Return Wilderness. And again, here you can see these dark green areas represent unprotected federal wildlands. Again, you can see that the ecosystem itself is much larger than the protected area. And so our proposal is trying to round out the protection for many of these core ecosystems. Finally, we move over again to the west, and along the Idaho-Oregon state line, the Snake River flows through Hell's Canyon. Hell's Canyon and the ecosystem that it comprises and represents is, of course, a great national treasure. It's currently protected as a national recreation area, but as we'll find out maybe if we have time, it's not really protected. So one thing NERPA would do would be give some more protection to that ecosystem, and it's greatly needed. So that's an overview of some of the ecological systems in the region. Let me just briefly explain what the bill does. It designates first and foremost wilderness areas, and it provides protection for most, not all, but the vast majority, and these are represented in dark green on this map, of our remaining roadless lands. The second thing it does is set up a system of biological corridors, and on this map these are the gray shaded areas, and these corridors will help to try and functionally connect these core ecological systems and enable wildlife to move in between them so that we can maintain genetic interchange. A third component of the bill is wild and scenic rivers. There are about 1,300 miles that are protected in this proposal. A fourth component is the system of national park study areas. I mentioned Hell's Canyon. I'd like to also mention the North Fork of the Flathead River, which is another national park and preserve study area that we'd like to set up. These would have the kind of protection a national park does while still allowing for some of the motorized use and hunting that people have come to appreciate and enjoy in these areas. The final designation in the bill is a system of wildland recovery areas, and on this map they show up in the red. These are areas that have been devastated by poor land management practices. They're suffering biologically, we've got silt in the streams, and the proposal would set up a wildland recovery system to try and actually create some employment doing restoration activities in these areas. So that's a quick overview of the proposal, and there it is.
Okay. Let's go to Mary now. Mary, could you perhaps explain to our viewers what an ecosystem is? I think it's a word that's bandied about a lot, and you've done a lot of work in Hell's Canyon. You're on the board of the Hell's Canyon Preservation Council, and perhaps you could talk about it in the context of Hell's Canyon.
Yeah, this Hell's Canyon, this far western portion of the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act is is an area that should be receiving protection right now by its designations. The deepest river cut canyon perhaps in the world is the Snake River Canyon with Seven Devils Mountains to the east in Idaho and the Wallowa Mountains to the west in Oregon. But it's really a little piece of Snake River that's cut off at both ends by dams. It has a series of areas that are appropriate for bighorn sheep, which can't be reintroduced right now because of grazing allotments for domestic sheep, and the domestic sheep pass a Pastorella virus by nose-to-nose contact with bighorn sheep, and within days or months the bighorn sheep are then dead. And it has areas of grasslands, remnants of native bunch grass that could be recovered, and this is an aspect of NERPA that Dan was talking about, the fact that the whole Protection Act doesn't just talk about preserving something that we haven't yet damaged, but taking some of these areas that we have damaged with timber cutting, with grazing by domestic sheep and cattle. Every inch of the National Recreation Area in Hell's Canyon right now is either a domestic sheep allotment or a cattle allotment, as it is administered by the Forest Service, even though sections of that National Recreation Area are wilderness. Timber cutting is going on into roadless areas in the ecosystem. So you have this fragmentation. You have domestic cattle down in the Imnaha River tributary, which is the farthest up from the Pacific Ocean and through the Snake and up the Imnaha that Chinook salmon come. And the cattle are allowed to wander right into the stream and defecate in the stream and cause erosion and sedimentation of the gravel spawning beds. So you have a number of kinds of human activities that impinge on the system. And another one is unlimited jet boat use in Snake River itself, in the bottom of this Hell's Canyon. It's a wild and scenic river designation by the federal government. It's bordered by a wilderness area, and yet the Forest Service allows unlimited use of jet boats the entire length of the wild and scenic river. Although if you're a floater, you have to draw a lottery and be one of 5 that are allowed to launch onto the river each day. So any one of these activities, whether it's cattle grazing, sheep grazing, unlimited jet boat use, timber cutting, road building, and a new road has just been constructed right down to the river, right next to an ancient petroglyph that used to have to walk through grass and woods to get to, not very far, but it was just far enough away that very few people wanted to walk that distance, and then when they came to it, it was a marvelous petroglyph, which is a rock that it has carvings on it, about 2,000 years old. And any one of these activities can unravel the ecosystem in ways that we don't know. But when you try to put the system back together to make it help it recover, then you have to understand the whole system. And then when you look at recovery and you look at what we don't know about what's falling apart about the system, it's absolutely essential to have all of these kinds of activities: wilderness, biological corridors, recovery areas, buffer zones, to cover everything that we don't know, and help provide the ecosystem itself with some capability of recovery.
So Mary, in the past, wilderness preservation has primarily taken place because we've tried to preserve scenically beautiful places, and a lot of them have been high altitude mountain peaks. So this type of proposal is very different from the traditional sense of wilderness that we know of.
Yes, and it's interesting, we'll get to discussion, I'm sure, on the political feasibility of NERPA. But, and people, from what I've heard, the main argument that people will give against NERPA, this attempt to protect entire ecosystems and connected ecosystems isn't politically feasible. But we have no choice biologically. Anything less than this is not biologically feasible. We have learned enough about what the large animals need, what salmon need, you know, that they aren't just something that you see suddenly in the Imnaha River. They've come all the way up from the Pacific Ocean, up the Columbia, up the Snake, and up the Imnaha River. And you can't have pieces of preservation without these connection movements and migrations of grizzly bear and caribou and wolves and salmon. And we're so fortunate in this area to have the large animals. When people talk about that a plan like this isn't politically feasible, there really is no other choice but to go for a plan like this. We know too much now about what animals and ecosystems need to do anything less. To the degree that we continue this patchwork wilderness preservation, we're dooming animals, and we know we're doing it, and we have no excuse to do that.
Thank you. I think probably one of the most controversial issues has been the jobs issue. And one of the biggest fears surrounding NERPA has been, well, if we're going to preserve this much land and so-called lock it up, which is a word that's often being used, that the economy of the Northwest is going to be affected detrimentally. And Tom, you've done a lot of studies on this, and obviously this is your field. Could you talk a little bit about what kinds of impacts to jobs and the economy we could see if, for instance, the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act were to go through?
Sure. I think there's 2 or 3 things that are very important to keep in mind in trying to put the economic impact of a proposal such as the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act, which in one form or another seeks to protect in the sense of limiting commodity development in almost all of the remaining roadless areas in the Northern Rockies. And that scares a lot of people. They've been told for so long that these lands, these wild lands, unroaded lands that haven't yet been entered, haven't yet become part of our commodity production base, that those lands are crucial to the state's economy. The first thing to keep in mind in evaluating that claim is that the vast majority of these lands, over 80% of them, have not been classified as being commercially valuable for timber, even by the Forest Service. And the Forest Service will classify almost anything as viable commercial timberland. So that even by the U.S. Forest Service standards, which lead to massively below-cost timber sales, economically non-viable timber sales throughout the region, even according to them, over 80% of these lands are not economically valuable for commercial timber production. So that that scales the problem down drastically to begin with. 4/5 of these lands are not planned to be entered for logging in any case. The second thing to keep in mind is that if all of these lands were put off limits for timber harvest, we would still have a very sizable and viable timber industry in the Northern Rockies. The survival of the timber industry in this region does not depend upon these lands being entered and logged. These are high-cost, isolated, slow-growing, low-productivity areas for timber production. They are not crucial for the survival of the timber industry. The third fact to keep in mind is that Montana's economy is no longer hitched primarily to extractive industries. If our economy had been or was tied primarily to mining and to timber, we would be in very, very bad shape, because the contribution those industries, those extractive industries, have been making in terms of jobs and in terms of income has been shrinking year after year after year. Fortunately, our economy isn't tied, is not dependent upon those industries, and has been able to expand despite the fact that those industries have been contracting. So that we have a lot more vitality, we have a lot more economic opportunity, and we're developing that now. One only has to look at just to pick a few examples, the Bitterroot Valley, or the Flathead Valley, or the Bozeman, Paradise Valley area. One can move around the state and find areas that have had the level of timber harvest cut drastically. In the Bitterroot Valley, it's a fifth or a sixth of what it was 20 years ago. And the Bitterroot Valley is booming. It's led the state in terms of expansion. The timber harvest in the Flathead has been cut in half over the last 15 years. And it's leading the state. I mean, it is the center hotspot, economic hotspot in the state. One can go area by area in Montana and see the evidence around us that we can have prosperity. At the same time, we preserve the spectacular natural landscapes and wildlife habitat that makes Montana, Montana. We don't have to sacrifice economic prosperity in order to protect the natural environment. And protecting the natural environment enhances the productive economic base that's providing the expansion in the Montana economy today and in the future.
Thank you. That leads us to you, Cook, and you are an outfitter, and you mostly a fishing guide. Is that
Fishing
correct?
guide,
A
right.
fishing guide. Okay. So you are relating directly with the kinds of people that are coming into Montana and spending their money here. Could you talk a little bit about what kinds of changes you've seen over the last few years, and how much of it, do you think that the recreation industry has grown? And could you talk a little bit perhaps about the values and the types of things that are making people come to Montana?
Sure. I think certainly that the amount of people coming to Montana to enjoy the landscape-related values such as fishing, hunting, whitewater recreation is definitely on the increase. And a bill like NERPA, which is designed to protect those natural values, is crucial to sustaining the outfitting, guiding industry, and sacrificing those types of wilderness type values is going to jeopardize, the recreation industry, I guess. I think NERPA provides a comprehensive approach to sustaining, fisheries certainly, and considering that people are flocking to this region to enjoy, our fisheries, our hunting, like I said. Past wilderness bills don't really ensure that we can sustain the people's desire to come to this region to enjoy those types of activities. I'd also like to say that I think it's a big misconception that this bill is the brainchild of outsiders trying to impose their ideas on Montanans. This certainly has a lot of broad-based support from recreation people like myself who are trying to make a living from guiding or outfitting or what have you. And I think it's time that our representatives realize that it's not only outsiders who are interested in the national forest management, but it's also natives and Montanans. So.
Is there do you have some, obviously being a fishing guide, you probably deal with more of the people that are coming in from outside of the state than for locals, because probably locals don't use a fishing guide quite
Right.
so often. What about, do you think that, for instance, fishing is compatible with non-wilderness land uses? I mean, can you talk a little bit about impacts that you've seen to the fisheries, just being on the river?
Definitely, we've seen just An example that comes to mind right offhand is the demise of the bull trout and our native West Slope cutthroat. Those are certainly two species that have declined in the past, and if the current trend of national forest management continues, we're going to see, maybe the extinction of these species. I don't know. I think that probably in the case of fisheries, wilderness provides crucial water quality to the downstream watersheds, and if people continue to enjoy these downstream watersheds, and as these watersheds are encroached upon through development and what have you, it becomes even more important that these high mountain water streams are protected via wilderness protection. And I think you'll see a decline in definitely water quality and fisheries if we don't provide an approach like NERPA to our remaining ecosystems.
Thanks. Dan, could you tell us that there hasn't been complete support from the entire environmental community for NERPA. Could you perhaps explain why some environmental groups are hesitant to support this particular bill? What kinds of problems they face, and maybe we could point out some of the stumbling blocks and how we can get around those.
Sure. And Mary alluded to this before, but I think that the only concern that I've heard, and the only reason why the proposal hasn't had even more widespread support than it does enjoy in the environmental community, is that some folks are concerned it's not a politically viable proposal. And I think that we've discussed this, of course, among the conservation community, and people are always going to have different views. A lot of folks would prefer to try and work with our own congressional delegation and encourage them to come up with proposals that would be more in line with the kind of goals that we all share. And our group has, in a sense, we've looked at the bills that we've seen from our congressional representatives, and they just haven't afforded the kind of protection that our watersheds and our wildlife habitat really needs. And our group feels that it's time for citizens to work to develop our own ideas with the support and involvement of the scientific, the economic, the recreation, the business communities, and try and put forward what we feel are important and necessary ingredients of a proposal. And that's the approach that we've taken with NERPA, and it's significant that we have been able to get support from a lot of local chapters of groups like the Montana Wilderness Association and the Sierra Club and the Audubon Society. And so I think that down the road, as these national and statewide groups hear from their grassroots chapters, we'll see more and more of them supporting NERPA and actively supporting it. And I think that we'll also send a good message to our delegation that we expect a little more out of them in terms of dealing with this issue, that they look beyond the rhetoric that has so enshrined the issue and clouded it in the past, and try and look for solutions that are progressive, truly, and that protect our economy as well as our environment and the quality of life in this region. So those are just some thoughts about, I think that the movement is kind of getting together a little bit more on this, and I've seen those changes in just the last year.
And I think it's interesting, too, that the staff of the congressional delegation and the congressional delegation don't really claim that their alternative approaches would protect the large animals. They say that isn't what wilderness acts are supposed to do. Wilderness acts are supposed to set aside pieces of wilderness that people can visit. But the real difference, the crucial difference around the NERPA is that it's not focused on something pretty for humans. It's focused on what are these animals going to need. And that's undeniable. So you really don't have people denying that this kind of system is what is needed for these particular fish and animals that we all associate Montana with. So for someone to say, well, the only politically feasible thing to do is the chunks of wilderness is, as I mentioned earlier, to say it's not politically viable to have grizzly bears, and it's not politically viable to have bull trout, and it's not politically viable to have bighorn. And is that what we really want to say as a society?
Yeah, and what I was going to ask you about too, Dan, is that we had a sort of political hot potato a couple of weeks ago when Senator Max Baucus blocked the introduction of the bill into Congress by Representative Kennedy. Could you talk a little bit about what happened and why perhaps Max Baucus did try to stop the introduction of the bill?
Sure, I'll try, and I can only speculate as to the senator's motives. I read an article in the Boston Globe, in fact, that where the senator and his staff was quoted as threatening to try and kill funding to clean up the Boston Harbor, a project that Representative Kennedy is very much involved in and wants to pursue. And of course, what does the Boston Harbor have to do with Northern Rockies wilderness, you might ask, and it's beyond me. But apparently the Senator Baucus felt that he had some control of that situation, and he used that influence and his clout to dissuade Representative Kennedy from introducing the proposal. I really don't know why. I would like to hear an explanation of that. It seems to me that the proposal, as any, should have its chance of receiving a fair public and open public debate and a debate in Congress. And it's unfortunate that even in this instance the democratic process broke down and failed us. And I think it again speaks to the need to try and come up with a new approach. The way that we've been dealing with the wilderness issue has stalled and resulted in frustration and tension for over a decade. And I think it's been mired in politics, partisan politics, for so many years that we owe ourselves another approach. And we want to see Senator Baucus, hear those concerns. We'd like that, and we'd like to move the dialogue into the issues and away from some of the political rhetoric and posturing that has characterized it.
And I think what's so appalling to people about this incident is the idea of using whole ecosystems as pawns. You try to save the ecosystem in my region, and I'll destroy the ecosystem in your region. And it's pretty
doesn't advance, the tasks at hand, which
Right.
are protecting what we do have that remains viable and restoring areas like Boston Harbor that are in bad shape.
I think there's an aspect to NERPA which speaks to the human spirit in a way that's critical too, because I think what we are facing right now is essentially a world of people who expect that the world is only going to get worse in the next decades and centuries. I mean, I think if you talk to almost anyone around the world and say, do you think there's going to be more biological diversity? Do you think there's going to be more tigers? Do you think there's going to be more clean water? Do you think there's going to be more salmon 100 years from now? And almost everyone will say no and feel pretty desperate about it. And it's mind-boggling to think that we have a whole world of people who expect that things are only going to get worse. And NERPA basically counters that and says, look, we don't have to go that way. We can set aside and act toward the world in a way that it not only doesn't get worse, this whole Northern Rockies area, but it actually recovers. And what that would do to the human spirit is quite amazing in terms of people feeling better about the future of the world.
Before we go on, I do want to remind our viewers that you're free at any time to call in with your questions. The number is 542-MCAT, so call in anytime you would like to ask any one of our speakers a question. Dan, I want to just go back to something else that Senator Baucus said. He claimed, and you brought this up, that this proposal was the brainchild of outsiders. And there are two things I want to deal with here. We're talking about national federal lands. These are lands that not only belong to Montanans, but to the people of Massachusetts, Representative Kennedy's state as well. But also, I mean, NERPA, as far as I know, has a tremendous wide support. It has support from a number of businesses and a number of organizations and many, many individual members. And also, it is not, NERPA has not been the brainchild of a couple of environmentalists who sat down at the table and said, well, let's just sort of stick a few pins in the map and decide on which wilderness areas. Could you talk about a little bit about all the kinds of people that were involved in putting together this proposal and the type of broad support that it really does have?
Sure. First, let me start and take off on what you brought up, that the lands that we're dealing with are federal lands, and I think it's important to remember that American taxpayers across the country are currently funding, through their tax dollars, the continued development in our roadless areas, and those management practices that the dollars have funded are responsible for now many of the problems we see. So yes, there is a legitimate right, and I say even a responsibility, for Americans from throughout the country to get involved in these federal lands issues. And then we do have to also realize that the proposal was developed with consideration and input from many different sources within the region. It's truly a made in Montana or a made in the Northern Rockies solution to the problems that are confronting us. The boundaries for the areas that we've proposed for the different designations were drafted and reviewed by local grassroots activists and citizens throughout the region. We got input for the recovery areas and the needs of those areas from water quality scientists, wildlife professionals, and others. And I think that that's typical of the way the proposal's been revised over a dozen times in the last few years as new information has come in. And so that is one reason that it enjoys broad support in the region. We've got over 350, close to 400 now, businesses and organizations that have endorsed the proposal, and many of these, in fact most of them, probably 3/4, are located here in the Northern Rockies. So I think that's significant. Every day we talk to new people who in the past were not allies in this effort, who are changing their minds and taking another look at the proposal and the kind of goals and vision that we're talking about. And so the support is strong in the region, and it keeps growing. So.
Okay. Thomas, talk a little bit more about the economy. One of the, again, it sort of goes back to the jobs issue, and we've seen a tremendous fight out on the West Coast in the whole issue about jobs versus owls, which we know that the issue is far more complicated than that. But do you think that in the extractive industries, which have obviously in the past played a fairly large role in Montana, do you think that if all environmental proposals or all environmental protection were to fall away tomorrow, that these kind of industries would sort of flourish, or are we going to always see a permanent decline in them and a change in the economy?
Well, all one has to do is take a look at Champion International and its operations just outside of Missoula here. Champion, because it was operating on its own private lands up the Blackfoot, and because Montana has no regulations controlling timber harvest, could plan and harvest its trees any way it saw fit. So it had no environmental constraints on it. It could do as it wished, and it did. It harvested all the trees, and now it's trying to sell the stripped land and the mill. So if one were to strip away all environmental regulations, chase all people with environmental sensibilities out of the state, which means would chase most of Montanans out of the state, and just left the landscape to the timber industry, we would see a repeat of what Champion International has done up the Blackfoot across the state. They would harvest all the trees, strip the land, and then leave. That's what they've done in every other part of the United States, and that's exactly what they would do here. So that there's the future of Montana cannot, and the future of the Pacific Northwest cannot be tied to the timber industry. if we believe that, we all ought to be packing our bags right now, because the timber industry has been engaged in harvest far beyond a sustainable level. The level of harvest that we've experienced over the last 2 decades simply cannot be sustained, even if we had no environmental regulations. So that there's going to be a downsizing of the industry in the Pacific Northwest and in Montana, no matter what. Even if the timber supply wasn't going to limit the harvest of timber, we would still see a downsizing of the workforce and the labor supply. In 1988, the timber harvest in Montana peaked. Timber production at our mills peaked. Yet the level of employment was 25% below what it had been in '78, and the level of income in real terms was 33% below what it had been in 1978. So despite peak levels of harvest, we had laid off a quarter of our workforce and had taken away a third of their income. And that's going to continue. The trees aren't there. Even if the trees were there, our timber industry would not be making use of our workforce. That's the future. That's why we have to diversify. That's why we have to protect what we have left before it's taken. And then we're left with a debilitated economy and a ravaged landscape from which we can't escape.
Mm-hmm. That is certainly one of the fears, and one can certainly understand the trauma of a timber worker who is working for a large corporation facing a job layoff that's extremely traumatic for anybody. But one of the cries has always been that it's been environmentalists that have taken the jobs away. But what you're saying is that mechanization of the mills has certainly reduced the number of jobs, and that has nothing to do with environmental protection.
Right. The labor content of our wood products has been declining steadily as the mills have been automated. The timber harvest is going to begin to be far more automated too, so the number of people working in the woods. Mm-hmm. Even if we weren't constrained by how many trees were there, the number of woods workers is going to mm-hmm. decline as that's automated too.
And how about the oil and gas industry too? Are they facing the same kinds of changes, or how is their industry impacted by preservation? For instance, preservation is proposed in NERPA.
Well, I don't see that as affected at all. The decline in oil and gas employment in Montana is not because environmentalists have locked up the land. It's because no one finds at the current time profitable development opportunities in Montana. The collapse in the oil and gas industry in Montana and Wyoming and Oklahoma and Texas, across the West, had nothing to do with environmental protection. It had to do with the fact that the industry is a very unstable, unreliable source of jobs and income. And anybody who wants to hitch the state's economy to that sort of wildly fluctuating industry that can lay off 4/5 of their employees in no time at all, and then wait 10 years for another boom to come along. That's not the sort of industry that can ever bring reliable prosperity to any local economy.
We have some footage to show you, so we will slip away for a moment, and then I'd like to come back to Cook and have Cook talk perhaps about what needs to be done with the public and educating the public about land preservation. So I think we'll go to some footage now. Are we off there?
Yeah, it's showing now.
Okay.
It's about
Maybe-
4 minutes long.
Okay. Maybe what I'll do is ask you next a little bit about how, what people that come on fishing trips know about wilderness preservation and NERPA and what we could do to help get the word out.
Okay.
Is there anything else
Carter,
specific that you
do
want
they
me to
screen the
ask
calls?
I'm really familiar with
You mean for
police.
cruises?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but, I mean, there were 2 calls, so
Yeah.
are
Oh,
they
yeah,
taking
no,
them?
it's cool. Yeah, I can just, I can
Fucking hell,
talk.
crazy.
Is anybody, anything else specific that's on
There was
the
one.
I'm just kind of winging.
You know, it was interesting this last weekend, when we were arguing with the Forest Service over Hell's Canyon, saying they're gonna take this particularly heavily.
Okay, we're back on the air again, and we have a call waiting, and let's find out what question our viewer has. Hello, you're on the air. We hope. Having a little difficulty here. Hello, you're on the air. Let me try one more time. Hello, you're on the air.
Yeah, hello. My question is for Tom Powers, and I'm wondering if he thinks that there will be an increased influx of out-of-staters into the state, and if so, is that going to provide a greater job base for the tourism industry within Montana in the future?
Well, if what we're interested in is growth, physical growth in the Montana economy, for better, for worse, we're getting it, especially in western Montana. And if you talk to any of these people about why they're moving here, you're going to find very few of them say they're moving here to become loggers or miners. They're moving here because of the quality of life they associate with Montana, the recreational opportunities, world-class recreational opportunities, our friendly small towns, etc. So I think that protecting our landscapes, one of the impacts is going to be that it does make Montana a far more attractive place. That's what we have going for us. There's the tourist side of it too, and I don't want to play that down, but I think thus far, if one asks what role has protected landscapes played in adding vitality to the Montana economy, it's first been in making it an attractive place for people to live, work, and do business, residents, new businesses. Then the second role that protected landscapes has played has been on the tourist side. So yes, it is going to bring both new residents and temporary visitors to the state.
Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Thank you. Kirk, let's go quickly to you again. We don't have a great deal of time left, but could you tell us, do you think that there is a great deal of knowledge out there about the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act, or do we need to get the word out to the public and let them understand that this is a process they can participate in, and that this is the people's bill and what's at stake here?
Yeah, I think more people definitely need to become aware of this bill, especially those outside of the region who aren't or haven't gone through our traditional wilderness fighting. And I guess from my perspective, I have a good way of educating the public, because I'm dealing with a lot of outsiders who come in and enjoy what NERPA is trying to protect. And if people who provide services like myself can talk about NERPA and what it means to protecting wilderness values, that's a step towards getting the word out. Other than that, there's just promoting like we're doing with television programs and.
Mary, I wanted to ask you quickly one more thing. You talked earlier about this being the only biological alternative that we have, and I think that we need to be able to tell people why it's the only biological alternative. What happens? What is going to happen ultimately if we have these isolated pockets of preserved wildlands?
Well, one example that comes to mind is this last weekend I was talking to some Forest Service folks over on the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest, which again is over in that far western part of NERPA in Hell's Canyon. And there's a particularly heavily, beautifully forested headwaters of a tributary to the Snake, and the Forest Service is planning on logging it because it might burn. So to prevent the possibility that the trees would burn, they're going to cut them first. And it reminded me in the Vietnam War when the military said, well, we've got to destroy these hamlets in Vietnam to make them safe for democracy. We've got to destroy this headwaters to make it safe so it can't catch on fire. And I said, well, why are you so worried about fire? And they said, well, the area is so small now, we can't take the chance of fires. We don't have a big enough ecosystem to let a fire come through, make an older system rejuvenated, leaving the very old trees, leaving room for new trees. We can't let a forest be a forest anymore because the area is too small. And there is no more eloquent argument for NERPA. We're trying to make an ecosystem big enough that the things that matter to us, like fire and catastrophes and bad years on climate and good years, all can work together, and the system still goes on living. And I think we have to confront our congressional delegation and the rest of the country with the reality that what they love right now, clear streams and heavily forested headwaters and wolves and grizzly, what they love depends on this bioregional protection. And it'll be fun to fashion it. It's not so much fun to fashion handkerchief-size preservation areas knowing we're dooming the animals.
And we are dooming the animals because I've read reports of species, various species that have existed in national parks that have disappeared over the years because certain national parks have become isolated.
Right, and too late we'll learn that the animal needed something. It needed to wander farther than we thought. It needed to migrate farther than we thought. It needed to connect up with some prey on a wider basis than we thought. And you know, NERPA allows us not to understand everything and still take care of things.
And there's enormous amount of risk with this loss of biological diversity, not only for the wildlife, but for us as humans too. There are several things that come to mind, but I want to talk a little bit also about, people have this idea that we can fix everything with technology, and that's not always the case.
No, and we cut ourselves off inch by inch by inch from a system that we learn from to one that we feel desperate about managing and correcting, and we've cut out fire here, and so now we have to spray it because the bugs are coming. We just get into this sort of intense, controlling everything, and it's all out of control, and we see it slipping through our fingers like sand. And it's happened again and again and again.
So NERPA, what NERPA does is it's trying to come up with some way of planning for the future, as opposed to having a Band-Aid approach to
That will fail.
That will fail.
fail. I mean, it's an attempt to give us back enough connected wildlife and wild lands that we can breathe a sigh of relief a bit and know that the system will take care of itself.
And Dan, there is no other land area in the United States that has this kind of biological diversity, or the opportunity to have this sort of proposal anywhere else. Is that correct?
Well, it's true as a general statement. I think that, the Northern Rockies is an area that it behooves us to practice the sustainable concept of ecosystems and their protection. If we can't do it here, then certainly we can't do it anywhere else in the lower 48
in the lower
states.
48, yeah. We only have 2 minutes left. I'd like you just to quickly talk about what is the future with the bill and what we can expect over the next few months, and perhaps when we might see it be reintroduced again. And just also talk a little bit about this political feasibility. It's really up to us whether it's politically feasible. Is that correct?
That's a great point. It really is up to us. What is politically feasible is up to people who vote. It's up to people who get involved and write letters, who express themselves on the issues. And I think that that's really critical, that folks take that step and get involved in that political process. We expect NERPA to be introduced in Congress sometime shortly this spring, and we're optimistic that we'll be able to do that with a bunch of co-sponsors and a lot of interest in Congress. And I would encourage people to find out more about the proposal. You can do that by calling the Alliance for the Wild Rockies here in Missoula. You can do that, again, you can talk to your neighbors and try and find out more about what the proposal does and why it's needed. We also expect that we'll see some wilderness release bills introduced in Congress shortly. Senator Baucus had a bill last year that would have released about 4 million acres out of Montana's remaining roughly 6 million undeveloped acres. And this year we expect Pat Williams to introduce a bill that he said would be about in that range of protection. So citizens need to get involved and let themselves and their opinions be known. So I encourage folks to do that.
Okay, one last question, Dan, if we have time. Do we have time for one more question? One of the issues that have come up is that we don't have time. Okay, we're going to end Naturally Speaking tonight. I'd like to thank all our guest speakers for coming, and we appreciate you taking time out to talk about the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act. So if you'd like to know more about it, call the Alliance for the Wild Rockies. Otherwise, we hope to see you again on the next Naturally Speaking, the last Tuesday of every month. What I was going to talk about, Dan, we can just have a discussion amongst ourselves.
Grandpa, Grandpa!
What?
Will I grow up to be big and strong like you?
I sure hope so, son.
Why wouldn't I, Grandpa?
Well, unless something is done soon, big old trees like me will be nothing but a memory, like the giants in the old fairy tales.
But Grandpa, what would the forest be without olds like you?
I think they call it a tree farm, son.
The American principle of participating, of working together to discuss what our country is doing and try to influence it. Lord knows, I might be wrong in my position towards Angola or any position in the world, but it's the American process to stand up and thrash it out.
And that's Alternative Views for this evening. Alternative Views is a production of the Alternative Information Network, P.O. Box 7279, Austin, Texas, 78713. If you have any comments, questions, please contact us at this address. Good night.
Shanti Bodo Shanti Amos Motim Sharanam Bante Yandoro Rosa Damiga Rosa Tumbare Zonda Do La Dacienda La Bontera Tundera Demo Ayata Dos Taiba Tumbale Bantao Ansheta Motum Betare Yasha
Good evening and welcome to tonight's episode of Naturally Speaking. My name is Tracy Stone Manning. I'm in this week for Bryony Schwan, who was unable to make it. Tonight we're going to be talking about one of the most elemental things of life around us, and that's water and Missoula's groundwater. With us we have Bill Wussner. He's a professor of geology at the University of Montana. And Charlie Vandham on the far left, he's an environmental planner with Land and Water Consulting, and Arvid Hiller with Mountain Water Company. And later Peter Nielsen, who is with the City County Health Department, is going to be joining us as well. And with that, I suppose I'll ask you all to maybe think of some questions as you're listening to our guest speakers, because tonight we'll be taking live calls. So Bill, start us off. We're going to be talking about the past, the present, and the future of Missoula's aquifer. And Bill's going to address a little bit about that.
Well, my name is Bill Wussner, and I teach groundwater geology at the University of Montana. And what I'm going to do today is, I guess, talk a little bit about the past, the far past, because we're going to talk about geological time and sort of how the aquifer formed here in Missoula. And if I could have the first slide. What we're going to look at here is basically, my main job as an educator, so I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about what groundwater really is. Could I have the next slide, please? When you think of groundwater, you have to think about it in terms of of not underground rivers flowing or caves, but you have to think about it more in terms of sandbox that's, when it rains, it fills up with water, and the water just sort of soaks into sand. So really, groundwater is that water which occurs below the Earth's surface, in which all of the spaces between the grains of soil are filled with water. And the upper surface of that is what we call the water table, which is indicated as that here on the slide. And the blue area there would be then termed groundwater. So when we talk about Missoula's groundwater, we're really talking about that water which occurs below the water table in the Missoula area. And again, think about it as water which is occurring between the grains of sand and gravel and not as big sort of rivers or lakes. Next slide, please. And we talk about aquifers, and in Missoula we have what's called an unconfined or water table aquifer. And in this situation, it's basically that the water table forms the upper surface. So as we go below the surface in Missoula, we find coarse sand and gravel, and that sand and gravel then becomes saturated or totally full of water, from 30 to 5 feet below the surface, depending on where you live. And that's what we talk about as our groundwater system, and then we term that a water table aquifer. So we have a water table aquifer here in the Missoula Valley. Next slide. And we also are curious when we do research about how groundwater moves around. It's really pretty straightforward when you think about it. Groundwater just flows from areas of high water table to areas of low water table. So as indicated on this diagram, you can see where the water table is actually higher up, higher in elevation. The water then flows from those high areas to areas where they're lower. And so we can map out the direction of groundwater flow pretty much by just looking at the position of the water table. So we go out and measure water levels in wells to try to figure out how groundwater actually moves. Next slide, please. The other thing to think about groundwater is that it is dynamic. It's not just a pool that's sitting underground, and it gets confusing because we talk about groundwater reservoirs. And a reservoir you think about as a dam and a lake, but it's not like that at all. It just means a big saturated bunch of sand and gravel that is storing water. And the water table fluctuates during the year. If we look at this diagram, this is really sort of what it looks like in the Missoula Valley, that the water table is typically lowest when we get into into March and early April, and then it rises as all the spring snowmelt occurs and the rivers start running full. The water table rises the highest then right about this time of year in late May and into June, and then it declines all the way back into winter again until it starts over again, that process, year after year. So if everything works right, it's a renewable resource where water is added to the groundwater system and then is removed from the groundwater system on an annual basis. Next slide, please. Then if we talk about water supply, and Arvid Hiller will talk a little more about that for mountain water, but the other thing to think about is when you turn your well on out there in the valley, why does water actually come into your well? And all that happens, as you can see from this diagram, is that when you turn the well on and start pumping water out, you actually lower the water table around the well. And if water flows from high areas of water table to low areas of water table, and just think about it in terms of that the water's flowing to the low spot, which is created by the well. And then that's why the water then can be pumped out of the ground, and you actually get groundwater then coming up. Next slide, please. And just one more thing to think about, if you have lots of wells in an area, of course all of them are trying to lower the water table some to try to get water to move towards them. And this is what this diagram gives you an idea about, is that these things we call the cones of depression, that area of low water table around the well, that the more wells that you put in an area, then they start to actually interact with each other. And so depending on how much pumping is going on and what the density of wells are, there may be problems sometimes. Next slide, please. Well, now let's just talk for just a minute about the Missoula groundwater system. And this is a slice through the earth, like looking at a piece of pie. And it's basically a representation of a north-south slice across the Missoula Valley. You could think about it going right up Reserve Street, maybe, for example. And what we have here is that you'll see that the brown represented here is bedrock. It's the same hard rock that makes up Mount Sentinel, and that rock is over a billion years old. So it's very old, and it makes up the mountains and the hillsides around here. And then the white area that you see here, we call the tertiary sediments, and that area is actually very fine grained. It's about 2,000 feet of silts and clays that have filled up the valley. And then above that is really our lifeblood. It's the Missoula Aquifer, and it's only about 150 feet thick, and it's coarse sand and gravel. So in a very simplest terms, if you looked at the Missoula Aquifer, you'd find that all of the water that we want is coming from a very thin veneer of sand and gravel over top of other deposits which do not yield water very easily. Next slide, please. Here's just an example of what that bedrock looks like. And if you think about that, you do get water out of it, but it's very difficult because it only occurs in the fractures of the rock. So to yield water from bedrock is usually that you can't get very much. So it's not a very good aquifer. It could never supply the whole city of Missoula or the whole valley out of the bedrock as an aquifer. Next slide, please. Now here we have the landfill area, and that happens to be located up in the tertiary sediments, which are on the side hills and underneath of the Missoula Valley. And these are very fine grained. It's again fairly difficult to find water because it is relatively hard to yield water out of this. It's they don't make very good aquifers. They're not very continuous. So they're, again, not good water-bearing units. We can't drill deeper in Missoula, in other words. You can't go down below the system and try to find more water after we get out of the sand and gravel. And the last slide that I have relates to what we're all used to seeing if we live in the Missoula Valley. And that's the sands and gravels and cobbles that we dig up in our gardens and that we excavate when we build a house. And that's really our aquifer system. And as we think about it for the rest of the discussion this evening, I guess the last thing I want to leave you with is that we have a very thin skin, which is a very thin soil zone on top of this very coarse sand and gravel system. And that's our only protection, because there's nothing to stop pollution or other contaminants moving down through that very coarse sand and gravel to the water table. That's the same water table that we're basically getting all of our drinking water from.
Thank you, Bill. Next, we're going to have Arvid Hiller speak. Arvid is the Vice President and General Manager of Mountain Water Company. He's going to address what they're doing about the groundwater issues in Missoula.
Okay, thank you. Bill has just described to you how the water gets into this valley, and I'm going to describe to you what we do with that water, and as a result of that, what we have recognized as being some of the responsibilities of being a water purveyor. First, to kind of give you a background of Mountain Water Company, we are an investor-owned utility that serves about 50,000 residents of Missoula with potable water for their daily use. It comes out of 34 deep water wells that average around 140 to 150 feet deep. We have a production capacity during any single day of as high as 60 million gallons a day, and our annual production ranges from 7 to 10 billion gallons a day. We have about 200 miles of transmission mains. That's how you receive your water there at your home through the transmission mains, and we have storage facilities that we pump into to augment the pumping capacity of around 7 million gallons. Coincident with me becoming general manager about 3 years ago, our largest well, the Maurice well, which sits over by the Maurice Avenue Bridge in the area of the University of Montana. It's a large well, pumps about 500 gallons, it's a 500 horsepower well, pumps somewhere around 6,000 to 7,000 gallons a minute, 10 million gallons a day. And that is one of the things that really heightened our awareness as to the potential for contamination of the resource here that we serve to the customers. We had a notification that within our system we had a contamination, and it became evident to us rather soon that a sewage lift station in the area of that well had malfunctioned and caused this contamination. That resulted in us having to issue a boil order for 4 days. During that 4 days, we maintained our telephones on almost a 24-hour basis. And during that time, we had some 6,000 telephone calls. It became real evident to us that people in our community were concerned, and it's the first time it was really brought to their attention how susceptible this contamination, or this aquifer, is to contamination. One of the predominant comments that came from those customers that called us although there was some criticism and some real heightened concern about health effects, the predominant response was, well, maybe this isn't so bad. That now we realize how susceptible this aquifer is to contamination, and we need to do something about it. This is what motivated a lot of the activity in the valley and regarding the interagency task force, which we were a part of. We had been working on a wellhead protection and an aquifer protection program, and it was in the research stage, but it had not gotten to the point where it really was producing a result of somehow that we could protect this resource. We had decided as an investor-owned utility that we still were not precluded from a responsibility that to try to move forward the protection of this resource for the community. It is our livelihood, but more importantly to the community. People in this state need to realize that Mountain Water Company does not own the water. Mountain Water Company just serves the water. The residents and all of the citizens of Montana have the right to the use of that water. And so we are charged with serving it, but we are also charged making sure that is protected. So we embarked on a wellhead protection study that utilized a firm out of Helena, Montana called Hydrometrics. Involved with that was a hydrogeologist by the name of Ray Lezouk. And under their umbrella of moving towards this study, they brought in the local city-county health department to do source surveys of potential contaminants to the aquifer, and also a local planner, Charlie Vandam, who's with us tonight, and John Horwich, an attorney out at the University of Montana Law School. We recognize that it was very easy, and it can be very easy, for people to forget how important it is that we protect this resource. Corresponding with this wellhead protection program that we embarked on, which was really the technical end of the work that had to be done, we realized we needed to keep the public's awareness up of the need to protect this resource. We thought it most appropriate that we utilize a local firm. In this case, it was Spiker Communication. We contacted them with all of our concerns and said, what is the main thing that we want to do with the public information education program? And it was that we wanted to keep the heightened awareness of the public as to the potential for our resource to become contaminated, because we felt if we kept it to the forefront that a lot of the hard choices that have to take place in a community to protect a resource as valuable as ours were going to have to be popular. They were going to have to be ones that people could accept that they're important enough and they're overriding enough importance is that we have to do it, regardless that there may be some expense associated with it. So we embarked on, and you've seen as I'm talking here, some of the illustrations of some of the billboards that we put out around different places in the public just to keep that up. I think a result of those efforts has been not only recognized from the media world in Montana in that they have given Spiker Communication awards for their efforts in this area. If you've noticed, the messages are simple. They are continually around the theme that we need to protect the resource. I think that the benefits of this has really been acceptance in this community that we do have to put this resource as number one. And when the hard choices have been made, a water quality district that was created last December of '92, the community was ready for that. There are other hard choices coming up in the future that are going to have to be made. Peter Nielsen of the City County Health Department, who is here tonight, is going to address some of those choices and how we've arrived at those. And we think that if people are just kept abreast of the fact that the alternative is not remediation of problems in water. Every piece of literature that you will read, put out by the EPA or put out by people that have studied taking things out of water, say that it's not the economical solution, that it is the last solution that you want to look at, that the best thing to do is keep things out of the water. We're hopeful by doing that in this community, we will be able to maintain this valuable resource. We have what is rated as one of the 10 best aquifers in the country when it comes to the quantity and quality of water that we have. Flows 425,000 acre-feet of water through it annually at a rate of 3 feet to 10 feet per, 3 feet to 27 feet per day. That is one that we have to keep clean. It's the best alternative and the cheapest alternative for the people that are going to utilize that water. With that, I would finish.
Just for one point of reference for the viewers, you mentioned that the Morris well had been contaminated. What was the contaminant and how did it get into the aquifer?
Contamination resulted from a sewage lift station that was about 140 feet up gradient from our well. Malfunctioned for 4 days, and actually the site there was surcharged with water to levels above its ability to contain it, and in fact it overflowed into the river at the time, but it also overflowed into the ground, and I think it best illustrated what Bill Woosner was saying about the inability for our aquifer in Missoula, because of its porosity, being able to treat effluent of any kind, and the fact that it travels so fast down through the gravel that it does that. Coliform bacteria was the contaminant. We even had a sample that had fecal coliform in it. Usually those particular coliform bacterias die in a very short time of travel. So it would illustrate that within that distance of 140 feet, ground 40 feet, lineal feet, and then down gradient through the aquifer of about 80 feet, that was not sufficient treatment by the soils to eliminate the coliform bacteria contamination.
Thank you. Our next speaker this evening is Charlie Vandam. He's an environmental planner with Land and Water Consulting here in Missoula. He's going to discuss about the efforts of proactive planning and how they can help aquifers.
Thanks, Tracy. I work with Land Water Consulting. We're an environmental consulting firm in Missoula, and I get involved in different levels of work related to groundwater contamination and groundwater protection. Some of the work that I enjoy getting involved in is groundwater protection, and working with companies like Mountain Water Company to develop wellhead protection plans or groundwater protection plans to try to protect the water supply. On the other side, I also get involved I work with companies, with corporations, with individuals that are cleaning up properties that have soil contamination, have groundwater contamination, and I deal directly with the cost that's associated with trying to clean up properties. We, at Land and Water, have tried to promote more proactive stance in groundwater protection. We like working in consulting firms where we're trying to protect the resource, protect the water supplies, and we see that it's a lot more cost effective to get involved in the early stages of planning to try to protect groundwater supplies rather than coming back and cleaning up groundwater contamination. In the efforts in working with Mountain Water Company, we worked on a wellhead protection ordinance. It was a ordinance intended to protect Mountain Water Company's wells by requesting or regulating businesses that could have regulated substances or what many people look upon as hazardous materials. Our focus was or what we had recommended to Mountain Water Company was to regulate those materials and try to prevent those types of materials from entering into the groundwater and causing a groundwater contamination problem. What we see in trying to be proactive is that we need to make an investment up front rather than trying to come back and clean up properties later on. This wellhead protection ordinance that we developed for Mountain Water Company was a draft regulation that we were hoping that the Missoula County and the city of Missoula could look at as in perhaps adopting in a means in trying to protect the groundwater supply. And we're still hoping that they could get to that stage. Again, I've been involved in several sites around Missoula where we're cleaning up contamination from whether it be Class 5 injection wells or dry wells that have come from automotive shops or leaky underground storage tanks. And some of the companies and corporations and individuals that have been involved in cleaning up contamination have incurred costs that range anywhere from $5,000 to $200,000. Those are costs that I think few people want to incur, and perhaps if they were to face those types of costs, they'd be more willing to invest in proactive measures to prevent that kind of contamination. We are encouraging the work that the Missoula City County Health Department has taken as far as developing a water quality district and looking at regulation to try to help prevent further contamination in the aquifer, and also trying to help out in public education efforts as far as protecting the water supplies. One of the more exciting projects we're getting involved in right now is the development of the Missoula Water Partnership, which is a volunteer group of organizations throughout Missoula that are trying to promote activities that encourage people's awareness of the sensitivity of groundwater in Missoula and surface water in Missoula. We have to find ways to encourage more individual responsibility and corporate responsibility in protecting our water supplies. And we're hoping the Missoula Water Partnership can be an integral part of promoting that awareness and promoting that responsibility. Again, I think the City County Health Department has taken some great steps as far as adopting a water quality district, but we hope to see public education as being a key element in any type of groundwater protection strategy that we develop. Not only regulation, but education is a crucial part of any type of measure to try to protect our water supplies.
I have just a couple of questions as a follow-up. You spoke of individual responsibilities and corporate responsibilities. Can you give us some real nuts and bolts examples of what they may be? For example, what would my individual responsibilities be as a person living in the Missoula Valley?
Well, in a lot of our actions that we take, there are many issues that we juggle in any kind of action we take. Let's say, for example, disposing of a gallon of waste oil. From a cost-effective standpoint, a lot of times we want to take the easiest and the cheapest opportunity and perhaps dump it on the ground. But that's lacking the awareness of the sensitivity of the resource, of the sensitivity of the groundwater in Missoula. And as far as individual responsibility, we have to understand the sensitivity of the aquifer and try to be aware of that and look at alternatives as far as disposing and looking at recycling motor oil, recycling paints, and try to be aware of materials that could cause damage to the aquifer and use them in a responsible manner and try to avoid disposing them in ways that could cause contamination.
What would some corporate responsibilities be?
I think it's the same thing. I think corporations have to realize that they're a part of this community, and the actions that they take can impact this community, whether it contaminates the groundwater or in a more direct sense contaminates their own ground, and they're forced with paying for it. We're basically all partners in Missoula trying to protect the resource that we have, and I think it is our job to learn about the sensitivity of the groundwater and to learn about what actions we can take to reduce the impacts on the groundwater, to reduce the contaminants or contamination that could occur in the groundwater. and surface water also.
Okay, thank you. Our last guest to speak this evening is Peter Nielsen. He is with the City County Health Department.
Thanks for inviting me to speak on this show. It's a pleasure to be with this distinguished group of gentlemen and yourself as well. We're real fortunate in this community to have folks like this who pitch in and help out with problems that we're working on to take care of our water quality, to have the strong scientific support that we've got from Bill Woosner and his graduate students and others at the University of Montana. We're very lucky to have that resource in this community, to have a water company like Mountain Water that's willing to put up its dollars and to speak as an advocate for taking care of our water. We're very fortunate for that. And one of the things that we're most fortunate for is to have a very broad base of public support for taking care of our water in the community. And the organization that Charlie Vandam has helped organize and others in the community, the Water Partnership and other groups in the community have spoken out very forcefully for taking care of our water. And this is just a real good, healthy combination. So it's a real pleasure to be here with these folks and to talk about our water. I'm anxious to get on to viewer call-in so that we can get some questions and get some dialogue going, but I wanted to say a couple of things. It's nice to be able to back clean up and be the fourth speaker to speak and to round up this important panel. I want to talk a little bit about the health department's role in all of this. The health department is a city and county agency that is responsible for taking care of protecting the health and the welfare of the citizens of the Missoula Valley. And the health department has very important roles in doing that range from providing health services to people who can't pay for them through our partnership health care system at the health department, as well as nursing services, women and infants and children's services. Our environmental health division takes care of air quality, water quality, sanitation in restaurants and trailer courts and all these sorts of things. But when you come right down to it, one of the very basic things that we need to take care of in this community to take care of public health is water. We're all made up of water. Water is a very important resource for us in terms of public health and also in terms of the economic vitality of the region. We've got to take care of this very basic resource in order to continue to exist here and in order to be able to stay here and prosper as a community. We need to have a viable water supply. Our role at the health department has been increasing pretty steadily over the last several years in terms of taking care of our water supply in Missoula, ever since the Maurice Avenue well incident that kind of gave us a wake-up call about how vulnerable we were to water pollution in the community. We've become more proactive and more active. And I believe very seriously that our department will be consumed by water quality issues for the next 10 years, much as we have been consumed with air quality issues for the last 10 or 15 years. These are going to be very important issues, and in fact, they may hit home more directly for a wider variety of people in the community than air quality has. So our department has been taking that very seriously, and the public is demanding us to be very much more active and proactive in protecting our water. Last year, we got very serious about trying to form what Charlie's spoken about, the Water Quality District here in Missoula. I want to talk just a little bit about that. That Water Quality District was created by the City Council and the County Commissioners in January of this year. And the Water Quality District is going to be a very important tool for us to be able to take care of our Missoula Valley aquifer. I want to start by showing a map here of what this is so people know where we're talking about. Hopefully you can zoom in on this. I'll try to hold it real still. This map, to give you a little orientation, this is the urban area of Missoula. I'll use this pen for a pointer. This is the urban area, downtown area. This is Interstate 90. This is where East Missoula is, and out here on the west end is Uson. There we go. Down on the south is Lolo. This red line that encircles the valley is the area that was designated by the United States Environmental Protection Agency in 1988, I believe it was, as a sole source aquifer. What that means is it's our only source of water in the valley, and there's really no economically practical alternative supply for us. We can't go to surface water. We can't go drill our wells anywhere else at a reasonable price. So we've got to get our water from here, and we live on top of our water, so we've got to take care of how we take care of how we act and what we do to our water. This black line that surrounds the red line is the boundary of the water quality district that was created by the commissioners and by the city council in January of this year. So it extends basically from East Missoula on the east and out to Uson, past Frenchtown on the west, and down to Lolo on the south. Now if I could switch to the slide that's showing. Here we go. That slide describes a number of words, the basic objectives of what we're trying to do with the water quality district. First of all, the mission of the district is very basic. It's to protect and improve both the quality of surface water and groundwater in the Missoula Valley. In order to accomplish that mission, we're undertaking 6 basic objectives. And again, this all starts in July of this year. Although the commissioners created the district in January, we don't have any of the money from the district until July 1st. So it's getting very close. We're getting ready to get geared up and have this program up and running in July. The first objective that we're looking for is to conduct monitoring and water quality research to assess and prioritize water quality issues throughout the Missoula Valley. We've been fortunate to already have a good start on research in the valley through the efforts of Bill Woosner and Mountain Water and others, but we still need to know much more about what we're doing with water quality in the valley. One of the things that we have to do is to be very certain that we're targeting our dollars effectively. When we're going to spend dollars to protect water quality, we need to know that we're spending them on the most important things. We need to diagnose the patient before we prescribe a cure. It's a lot like when you go to the doctor. If you're feeling ill, you expect a pretty good diagnosis of what your illness is before your doctor starts prescribing cures. We need to do the same thing for our aquifer. The second objective, briefly, is to conduct inspections of businesses, facilities that can affect water quality in the valley. Get out into these businesses and facilities and help these places understand how they can minimize the threats to the water quality, how they can comply with the regulations, and how we can prevent water pollution in the community. The third objective is basically to conduct enforcement of water quality regulations in the valley. And it's a very important tool that we have not had in the past. It's very surprising to a lot of people that we have not had enforcement authority to take care of our own water in the Missoula Valley. And the reason for that is that all that enforcement authority rests with either the state or the federal government. We now, with the Water Quality District, will have the capability of having that enforcement authority directly delegated to us from the state to enforce the state water quality law. That's a tool that we very much need. We no longer will have to do what we had to do last summer when we caught folks dumping toxic materials into the storm drains on Patty Street here in downtown Missoula. We'll no longer have to cite them for littering on public streets and get $50 fines for that. We'll be able to cite them for violating water quality statutes, and we'll be able to take better care of our water as a result. The fourth objective is to conduct public education, and I agree wholeheartedly with Charlie. This is a very, very important objective. There's no amount of regulation that we can do in the community, no amount of coercing or beating people around the shoulders that we can do that will be successful in convincing everyone to comply and protect our water, unless people understand the importance of taking care of our water and more importantly than that, are broadly committed to taking care of water quality in the community. So public education is a very important priority for us. The fifth objective is planning. We've never had a long-term plan for taking care of our water in the valley. We've been reacting to crises. We've been reacting to this issue and that issue, and usually after the fact. And that's a very inefficient way to take care of things. As both Butch and Charlie said, it costs much more money to clean up pollution, especially when it's under the ground in your groundwater, than it does to prevent the pollution from happening in the very first instance. So it's important for us to plan ahead and find ways to prevent pollution and work together as a community to get everybody broadly committed to taking care of the water. The last objective is to finance facilities to protect water quality, and this is a limited objective. We have only $100,000 maximum per year to spend on this, but we can do things like extend sewer mains into areas that are highly densely populated and are potentially polluted by a variety of sources, and we can take care of things like that with these dollars. So we're very excited about the capabilities that we have with the Water Quality District to begin to address some of these problems. But I want to stress that it's very important for everyone in the community to understand that it's not the kind of situation where you can say, well, now we've got a water quality district, the government's going to be able to take care of the problem for us. Water quality doesn't work that way. We're going to be able to have very strong tools with the Water Quality District. We'll have better knowledge, have enforcement tools, be able to do public education, but unless everyone gets committed to solving this problem together and understands that we all need to pull together and do our part, we're not going to succeed in taking care of our water. So it's very important that everyone work together.
Thank you, Peter. I'd like to remind the viewers that this is a call-in show. We're on live. The number is 542-6228. We'll take your calls, and one of these gentlemen will hopefully answer you. Peter, I had a couple questions about the Water Quality District, and you said that public education is really important. Did you find that the public wasn't educated to the point of accepting the notion of a water quality district? Were you up to speed there? How did that process go?
Well, I think it went quite well. The amount of protest that we had to creating the water quality district was relatively small, although there was a vocal protest from those who did protest.
What was it?
And it was about 7.5%.
No, I mean, what was the actual protest?
How did that work, do you mean?
Yeah,
Okay.
well, what were they protesting?
Okay, the way this works is that the commissioners and the city council proposed creating this water quality district, and that means that we establish fees that everyone pays for in the valley. Everyone who owns property with improvements on it pays a basic fee into this water quality district. For the basic homeowner in Missoula, that's $9 per year, or about 75 cents per month. For people who live outside the urban area that are not connected to a public sewer, it's $13 per year, which is about $1.08 per month. So the commissioners proposed this program that I've described very briefly, and we mailed out a postcard to everybody letting them know that this was coming, and they had a 30-day period in which to protest creation of the district. This occurred last November and December for anybody who missed that. I think it was pretty widely discussed and most people were aware it was going on. At any rate, during that time period, if 1 out of 5 people were to protest the creation of the district, that would have caused it to go to a referendum. It would have been put on the May ballot this year. That did not happen. The amount of protests that we got in a 30-day period was about 7.5%. And that speaks, I think, very loudly about the amount of support that we have for taking care of our water and the amount of understanding that people have in the community about how important it is to protect our aquifer, not only for public health, but also for the future economic vitality of this area.
Arvid, your Mountain Waters billboards, was there a reaction to that? Did you get phone calls saying, what do you mean I can't pour paint down the drain? I don't get it. I mean, did you get calls?
Actually, we got a lot of comments from people, not only friends, but business associates, service organizations that I belong to and other people belong to. The simplicity of the billboards, I think, is what impressed them most. The theme is what impressed them, and the simplicity is what got that theme across and kept it in the forefront. It really is easy. Everybody's seen the ad on national TV, pay me now or pay me later, when it comes to filtering, I think it is, changing the filter on a car. Well, the fact is that it's the simplicity of the message is what they commented on. But they said, every time they said, it sure doesn't hurt us to be reminded that we have a personal responsibility as either an individual in a household or as a business to see that we don't do those things that are improper that can contaminate. So the reactions were without exception positive towards the approach that we took when it comes to the theme.
Well, I think it is important. This is all fairly new. I mean, my parents, when they taught me to paint and clean, and I was never told that bleach couldn't be poured down the drain or that it's a bad idea to just chuck oil in the back alley. It's just not something we learned. I think we have a caller. Is this true? No, we don't have a caller. So, go to your phones, 542-6228, to call in to MCAT to ask these folks about water quality. Who among you can tell us about towns or valleys whose water quality has gone bad, and why it went bad, and what steps weren't taken, and the costs involved in cleaning it up? Do we have any case examples we could talk about?
I might just mention that it's not in this country, but about a little over a year ago, the mayor from a sister city in Germany, sister city of Missoula, was here. He made a comment that really struck me, because we were going through what our efforts were in trying to protect the resource. And through his interpreter, he indicated that he thought we were very, very fortunate in approaching it the way we were with proactive approach, because he said if their city had approached this 1,000 years ago, that their water would not cost 100 times what our water costs here. So he's saying that treatment was their only alternative. And I just really drove into me the fact that this is not a new issue. It's an old issue that wasn't addressed before. So, and certainly other people here have instances of communities that have had contamination problems.
Tracy, I might mention that just downstream from us in Coeur d'Alene and Spokane, those two communities have been real proactive about protecting water supplies. They have a very similar aquifer that we have in Missoula, and they began efforts to try to protect their water supply over 15 years ago and been very successful at it. We are kind of following their lead in a sense as far as the type of measures we're looking at to try to protect the water supply and type of regulations and things like that. In Coeur d'Alene, for example, they have instituted a zoning regulation that requires or limits densities of one housing unit per 5 acres in areas that do not have a central sewer system, which is pretty sparse density relative to Missoula standards. And that type of concern that Coeur d'Alene expressed has really been effective as far as encouraging the extension of sewer to outlying areas, and also encouraging infill development in places where we have investments in infrastructure.
I just might make a comment. I was out at the airport recently, and somebody went over and got a drink of water, an older gentleman, and he sat down and he made the comment, he said, "You know, this is the first place I've been in 10 years where I could drink the water."
Wow.
And I thought that sort of struck home as I was listening to him, and he said, you know, he talked like he had traveled around to a lot of different cities, but he was still at the point where he had drank Missoula water, and he thought that it tasted good. It wasn't something he could stand. In other words, it's not where you go to some cities and everything is heavily chlorinated, or you go to other areas where it's just poor quality in general. And I think your comment, have there been whole aquifers that have been totally destroyed? And I'm sure there have been, but more often it's wells that are serving large populations that have become contaminated from a very small source. We've had instances in the Missoula Valley where a storm drain or point source can affect over a square mile of aquifer and degrade the water quality just from a single point source spreading out as it moves through the aquifer. So very often there are wells like the Maurice Street well here in Missoula where that one well, even though it was a local contamination problem, it affected a large number of people. And there are lots and lots of examples like that all across the United States.
We were talking tonight about proactive planning for the future of our aquifer. And Bill, I believe you're doing a study that's going to hopefully lay some groundwork for us, so to speak. Could you tell us about that study?
Well, we hope so. What we're trying to do is to look at how septic system use actually affects the groundwater in the whole Missoula County, not just the Missoula Valley. And that includes areas like Sealy Lake and Condon, and looking around Frenchtown area, and then down here around Missoula too. And what we hope we'll end up with is some foundation about what really happens when we use septic systems and drain fields to dispose of our waste. In some areas, the geology and the aquifer characteristic is such that kind of disposal may be just fine. But in other areas, it may be extremely critical because of everyone who has one of those septic systems typically also has a well. And so they're basically drinking sometimes out of the same aquifer within which we put our waste. And if the septic system does a good job and there's treatment in the soil, then they work fairly well. But there are some geologic environments in the valley where they don't work very well, and I think we've got to figure out where those are, and then there has to be plans accordingly to address that in the future if we're going to have more growth in those areas.
I see. Well, we were talking also earlier, actually, I'll get back to this. As part of this study, we have a graduate student who's looking for a place to monitor. He needs a monitoring site west of Reserve Street. His name is Tom, help me out, how do you pronounce it? Mahalik.
Yeah, it took me a while. I hope that's right, Tom.
Tom is going to be looking at septic tanks out by Reserve Street, and he needs some people to come forward and offer up their homes, I suppose. And here's what he's looking for. The home must have a conventional septic tank and a drain field that conforms to current building codes. And several years of continuous septic system use is preferred. He'll need access, obviously, to the ground overlaying the drain field to install a couple shallow monitoring wells. And ideally, the yard area should not be highly landscaped because he's going to be digging a bit. There should be an open area, a field or a pasture, to the west of the drain field for a distance of several hundred feet. If this all sounds like something you've got, you may want to continue to listen to this list. There also should be a little development to the east of the site. He needs a site where the impact of a single septic system can be distinguished from the cumulative effects of many systems. So if you're interested, you can call him at 243-2341, and if you need to refer to this list, it was compiled by Sherry Devlin in today's Missoulian. So if you're out by Reserve Street and you want to help out with groundwater, you may want to give him a call. And I'd like to remind everyone that this is a live call-in show. The number is 542-6228.
Tracy, could I get back a little bit to the cost issue that you brought up a few minutes ago?
Please do.
I think that it's important for us to think about what it costs to replace a well. But there are other costs associated with polluting groundwater. Last fall, when we talked about creating the water quality district, we were talking about having everybody pay a fee. And we wanted to be able to say, well, what are you going to get for that fee? And we were able to do that, but we also were hoping to say, what could we avoid paying in the future if this is successful? So we did a little research at the time into what other communities have suffered in terms of economic damage from water quality pollution. And what we found was a little bit more staggering than I expected. When we started to look into it, we looked at we expected the most significant cost for communities to be polluting a given well and then having to dig a new one or having to put on a waste treatment system. And we found that those costs were in fact fairly significant. There are communities throughout this region. There's a community in Montana called Sheridan, Montana, that had to replace its public water system. And I can't remember the total cost on it, but it worked out to be something like $939 per person in the community just to put a new water system in. That's a pretty steep bill compared to investing $9 per month to avoid that cost. Here in Missoula, we looked at what the cost would be if we had to put all of the water that runs through Mountain Water System on a treatment system to treat some very persistent pollutants, and found that cost would be roughly $20 million. And that would result in a rate increase under today's rate structure is something like $35 per month for everybody in the valley, and that's a pretty significant cost. But those costs were dwarfed. Those kinds of costs were dwarfed in a study that was done in Minnesota of 21 different communities that had water contamination from toxic substances, primarily solvents, metals, those kinds of things that really can damage a water supply. And in those communities, sure, they had significant cost of having to replace their wells and having to put in water treatment systems, but they suffered much more long-term cost in terms of losses to their tax base, lost business opportunities, diminished real estate sales, diminished home values. You add all of that up and you extend it over several years. And those costs just dwarfed the amount of money that they actually had to spend in hard dollars to dig a new well or put in a treatment system. So it underscores the importance of being really, of having a long-term vision here and trying to protect our water. And I just wanted to show a map, and Bill, I don't know if I missed one of your slides, whether it might have shown this or not, but it indicates to us, if you can zoom in on this, some of the vulnerability that we have to water pollution in the community. And this map has a lot of fancy little blue lines. This is not a computer-generated map. This is done with a felt tip pen, but it is based on computer modeling of the Missoula Valley Aquifer. And again, to orient you, this area in here is the Missoula downtown area. These little red dots are public supply wells, many of which are Mountain Water Company's wells, but some of which, for instance, this one is the Elmar Estates well for a subdivision. It's about 6 miles west of town. These blue lines are the zones of contribution to those wells. What that means is, in basic, very plain terms, is that that's where the water comes from. It goes into these wells. The water comes from this area, and probably upstream of this area. The Clark Fork River provides the water that comes into our aquifer, roughly 85% of the water that flows into our aquifer. And it flows out along these little lines out to where we pump in these wells. Now, if we have a contaminant source here in Missoula, it can affect a well that's 6 miles downstream, because that's where their water goes. That's where their water comes from, and it may get there in a very short period of time. The water from Elmar Estate Subdivision's wells 6 miles west of town originates somewhere between Russell Street and Orange Street in downtown Missoula. And it goes underneath the Missoula urban area, where there's a variety of pollution sources potentially contributing contamination to the aquifer and extending a long way out of town. So we can impact an area, impact a lot of people a long ways away with pollution sources in Missoula, and it can cost us dearly in terms of having to replace those water supplies, and also in terms of long-term costs to the community in terms of our economic prosperity here, essentially. I just wanted to say that. Okay.
There you have it. For those of you who are interested in about individually what you can do to help the aquifer, there's a little, may want to get a zoom in on this. There's a little door hanger or refrigerator hanger or cork board hanger that I believe the Clark Fork Pend Oreille Coalition put together, telling you some of the alternatives, what you can do with paint, what you can do with your oil locally in the community, what you should do with antifreeze or pesticides or fertilizers. They also suggest that if you have any further questions, you call the City County Health Department at 523-4755. So if you have some things hanging out in your garage that you've been meaning to dispose of and you don't know how, call the County Health Department. And that number again is 523-4755.
In that regard, Tracy, if I could put in a little plug for an event that we're planning in September. On September 21st, we're going to have a Household Hazardous Waste Collection Day in Missoula. We haven't had one in Missoula since the mid-1980s. When we had that one, at that time, we were overwhelmed with the response that we got, and took in much more hazardous waste from households than we ever thought we would. We're planning a new one here in September. It will be very limited in scope. One of the most important things that we'll have on that day is a paint exchange, where people can bring in paint instead of throwing it away, putting it in the dumpster or putting it down the drain. Bring it in and let somebody else come and pick it up and use it. And we'll hope to have a lot of people both bringing in some paint that they can no longer use, but also be able to pick up paint that there'll be someone that you put to a productive use. We'll also accept waste oil paint, waste paint thinner, waste oil, and waste car batteries. All these things are very common, high-volume waste in the community that we can recycle and make some use out of, or dispose of more properly than putting them into the aquifer. It's a real good opportunity, and this will be funded by the City and County Health Department's Water Quality District, the City Sewage Treatment Plant, hopefully some contribution from other businesses in the community as well.
That again is on September 21st, so go check out your garage, and what has been stacking up there you now have the chance to get rid of. Well, I'd like to thank you for tuning in this evening to Naturally Speaking. You can tune in again Friday at 1 o'clock if you came in late and want to catch the beginning of the show. MCAT will be airing that again. Again, that's Friday at 1. Naturally Speaking appears the 4th Tuesday of every month. Bryony Schwan should be back next month to host this fine show. I'd like to thank our guests, Peter Nielsen, Bill Wissner, Arvid Hiller, and Charlie Vandam. I'm Tracy Stone Manning. Good night.